Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Mick Napier, and this is one of our, in the past, what have been very regular Sunday afternoon broadcasts with people we think have something significant to contribute to the discussion on solidarity with the people of Palestine. We've missed a couple of recent Sundays, but we hope that we'll be much closer to weekly than we have been recently. But today, obviously, the Turkish invasion of the northwest of Syria, sorry, and the attack on the Kurdish forces there is very much in the news. People have been mobilising around the world, certainly in Scotland, and I'm delighted today to have Sarah Glynn with me. Sarah, welcome.
Hello. Hello.
Sarah's here for two reasons. One, I've known her for a while and highly esteemed the work she did as a founding member of Scottish Jews Against Zionism, a stalwart supporter of Palestine over many, many years, and not just stalwart, but sharp with it. She's also a co-convener of Scottish Solidarity with Kurdistan, and in that capacity, she's going to speak and discuss with me today. And we'll take a look at the various issues that are raised when we look at the struggle of the Kurdish people in Syria and beyond for freedom, and the struggle of the Palestinian people likewise for freedom. The relationship's not always clear, but Sarah, you were in Rojava, was it this year or last year?
Last May 18, yes.
So just over a year ago, and you've seen the unfolding disaster over recent weeks. Maybe we could start off by you telling viewers and listeners what you saw in Rojava. Why did you go? How long were you there? And what were the kind of impressions that you bring back with you?
Well, like very many people on the left, we've been going around carrying banners saying another world is possible. And then suddenly you hear about people who actually are creating that other world, who actually are trying to create an alternative to the capitalist system and a real bottom-up democracy, and an extraordinary part, to be doing it in the middle of the war, a democracy that really promotes women's rights in the Middle East and also prioritizes ecology and different ethnicities getting on, working together. And I just wanted to go and see it for myself. And, everybody said, well, it's in the middle of a war zone. Are you sure this is a good idea? Well, actually, everybody said it's not a good idea. But I was involved with Scottish Solidarity with Kurdistan. We got an invitation to go on a women's delegation for 2 weeks that May. It was incredibly busy 2 weeks. They took us around meeting a lot of people involved in all sorts of levels, running things. And I think perhaps the two things that really struck me was the commitment. And the commitment, obviously, you see it when you go to see the cemeteries of all the people who've died defending that land and fighting ISIS. But also the commitment in people's lives, the commitment to create a different society, so that here in Scotland, when we do politics, quite often it's like an extra added on if you've got time at the end of a busy day. And there's a Kurdish saying, resistance is life, and it's really, they are living it, they're living that resistance.
So national struggles of Algerians and Vietnamese or Kurds or whatever, they are national, and they can have very, very different social contents. They can be relatively conservative socially, or they can be quite radical. But you were struck by the democratic and the egalitarian content of what was going on inside the zones controlled by the Kurdish militia. Is that right?
Absolutely. That's what made me go. It was to see people creating something better. And it's always a work in progress where, it's really hard to create a different form of society. But people were committed and people were moving in the right direction. And that is terribly inspiring. And all that is just being wiped out, at the moment. It's just, are people going to survive? it's come down to, are people going to survive, or is it going to be mass genocide? Not that society is, those ideas, you can't get rid of ideas, so those ideas will go on. But I think what I wanted to see was as well, I think, so many liberation movements started out with these, very leftish, progressive ideas, and an awful lot of them have given up on those ideas. And at the time of the Soviet collapse and things, the movement, the Kurdish movement that was, around Abdullah Öcalan, started off very much as a Marxist-Leninist, classic, standard Marxist-Leninist liberation movement. But rather than sort of giving up on those ideas and just saying, all right, we're going to have another liberal democracy or whatever, they've actually found a new way of doing things, and they've adopted a lot of the ideas from Murray Bookchin, the American thinker, and other people as well, and actually, come up with what they call democratic confederalism, but it's this really grassroots, bottom-up democracy, and it's really inspiring.
So if you look at, say, South Africa, we had to support, those of us who were as old as myself, the struggle against racial apartheid in South Africa. But as often happens in national liberation struggles, the mass of the people who do the fighting and dying are robbed of the prizes afterwards. There's a new black middle and upper class in South Africa. There's a slaughter of miners who struggle against the system there after, post-apartheid. So in Algeria, you see a very corrupt bureaucracy forming the government, facing mass opposition. But they fought a heroic struggle for independence in their own time. But the fruits escaped the mass of people. Are you suggesting that there was a solution to that in the Kurdish areas, Sarah?
I think so, because I think it's absolutely central to the fight, is that they're not just fighting for freedom, but they're fighting for a very different world. And that is so integral. And I think with so many of the other struggles, there were a lot of people involved who very much wanted to see a different world, but sort of put those arguments aside to form a popular front or whatever, just to fight against the colonial oppression, and then afterwards we're told, thank you very much, but now we're running things.
So I wonder if they've read Brendan Behan. As a youth, I was really, something I'll carry to the grave is one of Brendan Behan's plays, where he describes how during the war for independence against the British, the IRA was fighting a campaign, and they said, we have to have landlords and businessmen and everybody in the struggle. And he describes, Behan describes a situation where he goes to some area where the farmers or the small peasants had taken over the land belonging to a great lord, and they were dividing it among themselves. And the IRA came and said, look, well, no, he's a patriotic landlord. This is premature. You have to wait. And Behan has these guys saying, sure, we believe in a 32-county republic. We're just taking this as a first installment. And that was the line that divided those two views of struggling for national independence. So you're saying that in the Rojava area, there were real concrete health and welfare and living condition advantages accruing to those who joined that struggle. Yeah, they could see a difference in their everyday lives.
They could see a freedom very much. And it was still a war situation, so things were very short. Life was hard, but people were getting involved in doing things and, taking control of their lives. And of course, the biggest change was very much for the women and the say over their lives that they have gained. And not just for the Kurds, but for all the different peoples in the areas that the forces liberated from ISIS, which covered the area.
Sorry to interrupt you. So people have a tendency to talk about the Kurds or the Palestinians or etc. But who are the YPG? There are many different political forces at work in Kurdish areas, as in any part of the world. What distinguishes the YPG, and what are their relations with, say, some of the so-called feudal Kurdish elements in the north of Iraq or elsewhere. Could you share your thoughts on that, Sarah?
Well, you've got Kurds predominantly in 4 different countries because they were divided up after the First World War. So you've got Kurds in Turkey, in Syria, Iran, and Iraq, as well as obviously a diaspora across the world. And yes, of course, not all Kurds aren't born with a particular philosophy. The Kurdish movement that is dominant in Syria is that of the ideas of Abdullah Öcalan, the Kurdish leader who's in prison in Turkey. And his ideas inspired the PKK guerrilla movement, of which he was part, and also inspired the political party in Turkey, the HDP, the People's Democratic Party. And they're the ideas that have inspired the PYD which is the principal party, but there's other parties as well in Rojava. Just to explain, because it's really complicated, all the different names. So Rojava simply means the West. It's the Western Kurdish, it's the Kurdish word for the West. So it's the word they use for the Western bit of Kurdistan, so the Syrian bit that has Kurds in it. And it was very much the word they used when initially they took advantage of the sort of power vacuum of the Syrian civil war to declare that bit autonomous. And at that time, they just had control of the sort of predominantly Kurdish bits in the northern strip of Syria. But then when they were attacked by ISIS and then they fought back ISIS and actually liberated much larger areas, they changed the name because they didn't want it just to sound like a Kurdish name, because very deliberately they were trying to bring all these different ethnic groups into this democratic federation and different way of running things. So they've, of course, had to work actually with sort of ethnic leaders of other groups as well, and probably some people who are rather less democratic, I suppose. But then, yeah, looking at the other predominant Kurdish groups, of course, you've got the Kurds in Iraq, where they've got an autonomous area that's been generally accepted with the Kurdistan regional government. And the people there who are in control, that's a much more feudal, traditional system, and also actually was much more friendly to Turkey, though I think they're having, they are definitely supporting I mean, they haven't supported the people in Rojava, but I think there's a lot more support coming from them with this current attack. So you've got, Barzani in Iraq, who is not politically progressive at all.
So look, people struggling for their freedom, if you're being chased by some somebody put it to me a few years ago, if you're being chased by some BNP types, a black person would be sensible even to run into a police station. It's not quite as dangerous as it would be outside. You're not out of danger, but it's temporary protection.
But there doesn't seem to be a police station in this instance.
So the Kurds have been betrayed by Trump, who did give a green light to Erdogan to invade. What's the latest news about what's happening on the ground there, and why do you think that protection, if we could say, was withdrawn?
Well, I think it surprised everybody, to be honest. The Kurds had no illusions in the Americans. They knew that the US was just there for their own interests, but they did think that the US might be a little bit better at knowing what was in their interests. And I think that what Trump has just done doesn't seem to help the US in any way either. I mean, I think it's an extraordinary thing to have done. I mean, I think they always knew that, no one was on their side. You've got the different imperial powers. I mean, Russia hasn't got their interests either. They're just playing a much cannier game. And then you've got Turkey and you've got Iran, and they're all in there for their own interests. I mean, I know, I've heard it said that what the diplomats say, that while the US was playing tiddlywinks, Russia was playing chess, that, you know, they've just been playing it quite cleverly. And of course, Turkey's been playing both sides off against each other, because, I mean, both America and Russia, because they're both trying to woo Turkey, basically, woo him to stay in NATO, or to, you know, go against NATO. So neither of them want to upset Turkey. But why Trump falls up, you know, not only withdraws the troops, but then is practically quoting Erdogan's propaganda about ethnic cleansing. It's just, it's so disgusting. It's almost impossible to watch. And of course, he hasn't withdrawn the troops to take them. You know, he says he's keeping a campaign promise to take the troops out of the Middle East, but actually the latest lot of troops are being redeployed in Iraq.
Tell us, bear with me a second. Just trying to pull up an image here. And failing. Can you tell us about the latest news? Have the tanks rolled across the border? A militia's no match for a NATO power, however heroically they fight. What are you hearing from the Kurdish area?
I mean, we're all just trying to follow everything on various tweets and messages and stuff, so I'm not sure that I'm, you know, any expert on this. We had, of course, the so-called ceasefire, which was never a ceasefire. I mean, it was basically telling the Kurds to withdraw and handing Erdogan everything he asked for. But there's no one stepping in to protect them. I mean, they have appealed to Syria and Russia, but Russia is not going to stand in the way. I mean, maybe they're probably divvying things up between them, Russia and Turkey. You know, you have the east bit, I have the west bit, and and it'll all be tied up with how they see the future of Idlib as well. They don't give a, you know, they don't really care about the Kurds who are just caught in the middle. So it's all strategic for them. I know that after this so-called ceasefire, I don't know if there was still bombings after that, but certainly Turkey has been using on the ground these appalling mixture of gangs, really, of people who formerly fought with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, these really, really nasty jihadist gangs. And this is what they did in Afrin too, which was the most westernmost bit, which they invaded and captured at the beginning of last year. And in Afrin, we've seen what happened, that well, thankfully, a large portion of the Kurdish population of Afrin did leave, but is now stuck in refugee camps, and goodness knows what's going to happen. But the people who were still left, I mean, they brought in a whole lot of jihadi families from Ghouta, I think it was. And it's run by, well, run isn't the right word. It's gangland, it's looting, it's rape, it's abductions, it's kidnap for ransom, it's deliberate destruction. I mean, it's absolutely appalling what they've brought there. And it's these same people that Turkey is using now, these jihadist gangs. So even if maybe, and I don't, if they're not, they may not actually be bombing, but certainly these gangs and these jihadi groups are still absolutely hitting the areas. And we've seen targeting of hospitals, we've seen targeting of water supplies, we've seen targeting of civilian convoys, and we've seen the use of white phosphorus. And it's just been appalling. I read a comment that from someone remembering Cyprus in 1974, and they'd said that when Turkey declared there was going to be a ceasefire initially, they had control of 3% of the land. they'd broken the ceasefire within a day, and ever since they've controlled 37% of the land. So yeah, a Turkish ceasefire means nothing.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yes.
Please finish. Let's talk about strategic alliances. So, for example, to take an example outside what we are talking about now, the brutal regime in Khartoum was so horrendous that it generated a huge rebellion in the south of Sudan. The Israelis were able to fish in those troubled waters because of the Arab nationalist nature of the Khartoum regime. In Iraq, given the history of gassing of the Kurds by Saddam Hussein, the genocidal violence towards the Kurds, it wasn't difficult to play the card of hostility to an Arab nationalist regime. And we hear the Israelis were fishing in troubled waters in the autonomous area in the north of Kurdistan. But that's not the whole story, is it? There have been strategic relations between Palestinian and Kurdish resistance groups, have there not? Could you comment on that, Sarah?
Yes, I mean the freedom fighters from both sides have recognised that they're both fighting the same battles, and yeah, there's been and continues to be support and solidarity between the left, people on the left, from the Palestinians and from the Kurds. We know that for their own strategic reasons, yes, Israel likes to interfere with Iraq and be pro-Kurdish in Iraq but that's for their own reasons, and they have been, and they never went quite as far. The autonomous area of Iraq had a referendum on independence, which was won massively in 2017, and Israel was very supportive of it, but they didn't actually recognize it as an independent country because they realized that would actually be a dangerous thing to do. So even when they're playing at being supportive, they're not totally supportive. But no way is Israel going to be supportive of anything that would injure their relationship with Turkey, because although Turkey claims to be supporting Palestine and Israel claims to be pro-Kurdish sometimes, actually Israel and Turkey continue to have strong trading relationships. They have in the past even had military exchanges. So they're all acting for their own self-interest. I just looked up actually the sort of extent of trade that's been happening at the moment, and roughly in this last year, Turkey will have exported $4 billion worth to Israel, and Israel will have exported about $2 billion worth to Turkey. So thanks. That's in the last year, you're saying, or in the last year or so. Yeah. So this is well after the massacre of the Mavi Marmara by Israeli commandos, which is a spat between the two governments. But you're saying the strategic relations in the background continue to hum. Trade goes on. And, they both, each criticizes the other in a completely hypocritical way for doing to their minority what they're doing themselves. So, and there's so many similarities in the way that Turkey treats the Kurds and Israel treats the Palestinians. So you've got sort of 15 to 20 million Kurds in Turkey. And both places are basically run on a blood and soil nationalism. They're both ethnic, national, one people, one nation, one flag places. I mean, the difference is, I suppose, that in Turkey they try and make the Kurds be Turkish, whereas the Israelis could never make the Palestinians be Jewish, so they just want them to be totally separate. But the way that each looks down on their very significant minority group within their area and the treatment that they get is very, very similar. And even the sort of rhetoric as they're attacking across the border of claiming that they're doing it for protection, for safety, and that the other side's always terrorists, and using that idea of the war against terrorism. And the other thing that's very similar between the Israel and Turkey today is that they're both absolutely strong neoliberal states, and it's that free market business above everything else that that both espouse. So they're hardly going to be very sympathetic to the Kurds in Syria on that area either.
Can I just clarify something? I mean, I know Palestine very well. I've been there 19 times, I think. The Israeli army can kill with impunity. I mean, if they're careless and they get caught on video, there might be repercussions. But generally speaking, they can kill Palestinians without a second thought. What's the situation in the Kurdish areas of Turkey under the Turkish state? Because I'm thinking there's a compact, much larger population there, but is the reign of terror equally intense, or is it somewhat ameliorated by the very numbers of Kurds and their ability to resist?
Well, if you look at some of the places in the Kurdish southeast, they can look like bits of Gaza when it's been under siege. I mean, they have brought the tanks in. They have. I mean, this is in response to any attempt at sort of running things a little bit differently, because all those ideas that have been put into practice in Rojava, in Syria, are ideas that people have also tried to put into practice to a certain extent in Turkey as well. Mainly they throw people into prison, and where you can be treated abominably. But there's been huge displacements. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people have had to up and leave their homes.
I'm just trying to get a handle on the reign of terror, because I've never visited there. And I guess I'm asking, is there a huge prison population, as there is in Palestine? Is there a suspension of normal civil liberties in Kurdistan? Can the army behave with impunity, or are they kept on some sort of good behaviour when the cameras are around, or the BBC might? Well, there's no reason why they would go there. But I don't want to be comparative, but it's quite ferocious in Palestine. You're saying it's equally ferocious in Kurdistan and Turkey, yeah?
Well, it's hit in waves, really, and I suppose particularly when they've done it, the Kurds seem to be winning things in elections, then they can expect an absolute clampdown. And of course, it's not just the Kurds, it's anybody who speaks up against the government in Turkey. I mean, it's that the Turkish fascism extends much beyond the Kurds.
But for example, I know that in Palestine, Palestinian flags were illegal in the occupied territories. Anybody wearing the colours of the Palestinian flag in a thread on their clothes would be taken off to prison. There was total suppression in the past, and the Israelis had to retreat from that because of the Intifada. I believe in Kurdistan, Kurdish was banned. There were serious bans on the use of Kurdish in education. Could you elaborate on that? And did the Turks have to retreat from that, and have they had to allow, say, Kurdish radio stations inside the Turkish state?
They made a few retreats on things, particularly when they were trying to become members of the European Union. So they had to look a little bit better when they did that. But just to give you an idea of the extent of suppression, really, I was talking to a friend who now lives in Glasgow and comes from Turkey and was involved in politics, not in a sort of huge way, but involved in politics in Turkey, and had been, as most people were, imprisoned, tortured. It was only when he came to the UK, he went to see his doctor and said, could I have a prescription for depression, and the doctor, instead of just giving him stuff for depression, said, well, why are you depressed? What was causing it? He said, well, of course I'm depressed because I've been in prison and I've been tortured and it comes back at me. And the doctor said, well, you should be getting some sort of help with this. And he said it was only then that he realized that this wasn't a normal state for people to have to undergo, because in the world in which he lived, you know, people were in and out of prison. People do have members of their families who've been, you know, just murdered. And the other thing that's really, really similar with the Palestinian situation is the sort of collective punishment of the people and the classing of a whole people as terrorists. So just to be Kurdish is and you know, not to regard yourself as a primitive mountain Turk, which is how they would see you, is itself deemed to be, you know, an act against the government.
Yeah, the only time I ever went to an EU official body in Geneva, I was there for something else, and I got dragged along to a report by the EU group charged with studying the human rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And there were a few timid questions by some of the people listening to the report back. There are no Palestinians, citizens of Israel, 25% of the population, none of them working in certain ministries. They're allowed to work in the health ministry, but other ministries, no Palestinians. And somebody asked the question, why are there none? And the guy said, look, we asked the Israelis and they said, well, these Palestinians don't want to work there. And that was allowed to go. But they're banned from, they're economically massively disprivileged. Is it the same with the Kurds in Turkey? Are they kept out? Is there a huge glass ceiling?
Well, certainly the areas, I mean, they tend to be in the southeast, and those areas are very much underdeveloped, so that it's been described as an internal colonialism in the way those areas are treated differently, and decisions are made in Ankara and just imposed on them. And just as an example, recently, I don't know, people may have heard of the Hasankeyf Dam. I mean, there's been a lot of dams actually, but this one is particularly awful because it's going to flood and destroy an ancient city, loads of archaeology and culture. And this is all in a predominantly Kurdish area, and all the benefits from it will not go to local people at all. I mean, it will go to the people in Ankara. It's not going to, and there's been massive outcry. And of course, protest has been massively restricted as well.
Something you mentioned earlier has just been ticking away in my brain. The notion of an internal colony, but also you said 5-10 minutes back, the Turks are trying to kind of disappear the Kurds by forcing them to integrate, speak Turkish, and so on and so on. I've got a Canadian passport, and a similar attempt has long been made in Canada against native, First Nations in Canada, language, forcing them to go to English-speaking schools, kidnapping them even, and having them adopted by white Canadians. It's a gruesome history. So I just wonder, I've never seen this before in all the literature on settler colonialism, from what became Liberia to the Japanese in Manchuria. It's not exclusively a white thing. I wonder if that template could even fit to some degree in terms of the Turkish attempts to disappear the Kurds in order to, and as part of a colonizing process. Do you think that's got any value at all?
What, the idea that it's internal colonialism?
Not just that, but settler colonialism, an attempt to disappear. Aborigines were whitened in Australia. And if you're trying to, you can disappear the people by killing them all in North America in the 18th century and killing them all in Australia. But you can also kill them all by forcing them to abandon language and culture.
To assimilate completely.
Does that fit? I mean, I've never seen this anywhere in the literature, but could that template fit what's happening in Eastern Turkey?
A certain amount, I suppose. But I think it is, I mean, the internal colonialism is a phrase that the Kurds have used themselves to describe it. So, and actually, to me, it struck as well a lot of similarities with the treatment of Bangladesh when it was East Pakistan, you know, the way it was
Yeah.
treated as, because that was similarly, the independence struggle there focused on language and culture and the suppression of the culture and being treated always as second-class citizens from, you know, well, in that case, Islamabad.
Yeah. The Turks aren't trying to move in whole Turkish families, are they, to dispossess Kurds? It's not. It doesn't have that nature. It's another type of colonialism. Is that right?
No, I don't. I mean, there may be a certain amount where they are trying to do that. Of course, is in Syria. I mean, they announced it. They've announced it at the UN that they're planning this massive ethnic cleansing, because they're going to, what they say they're going to do is bring in all these the Syrian refugees. There's over 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, which I think the European Union actually pays Turkey a bit to look after and keep there. And they see this as a very cunning way of, if they plant them in northern Syria, then instead of the Kurds, then it solves lots of problems, because they've got a lot of pressure in their cities from people saying, we don't want all these refugees about. So, of course, they're absolutely using these poor refugees who aren't, on the whole, from that part of Syria at all. And there's been attempts at Arabization of that area before by the Syrians too, because Syria was the Syrian Arab Republic. They didn't like the Kurds either. The Kurds in Syria, I mean, some of them were denied citizenship, which meant they were also denied proper education. They were really treated very badly within Syria. They're treated badly wherever they are.
I mean, the Syrian, can I just ask, by the way, it's not my field of expertise either, but the Syrian regime in the past was brutal, massively brutal towards its population. It tried to present itself, because it was against the political Islamism and claimed to be secular, Ba'ath and so on. They presented themselves, and it was very useful for dividing and ruling the population for a long time. They presented themselves as the protectors of minorities, Druze and Shia and so on. Did that, however phony, did that blanket notionally get extended to the Kurds, or were they outside that equation?
Well, as I say, they if they weren't accepting them as citizens, that doesn't, and tried to Arabize their areas, not really.
So they were kept outside it, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Sarah, can I move it to take a wider look now at what's happening? You've been active in Palestine solidarity. You're active in Kurdish solidarity. I, like you, start off from the idea that these popular struggles against imperial domination, need to find allies. Now, you'd be saying, and I would be saying, the Palestinian struggle shouldn't be looking to Erdogan, who emerges from this strategic alliance with Israel, as an ally, but should be looking to other popular struggles, from Algeria to Sudan to the Kurdish areas. What would your advice be to supporters of Kurdish solidarity who say, keep Palestine at a distance, or supporters of Palestine solidarity who say, let's keep the Kurds at a distance and take a narrow view? Could you give us your thoughts on that? I'll pile in as well.
Absolutely, to support each other as the political thinkers on both, you know, among both the Kurds and the Palestinians would say, you know. I mean, Leila Khalid has been very outspoken and has spoken at the HDP, the Kurdish HDP meetings, and the PKK has spoken out in support.
For those who don't know, an icon of Palestinian resistance, Leila Khalid. Sorry, continue.
Yes, no, so she's been very outspoken in support of, you know, this leftist Kurdish movement. And I think, and I would actually see to anybody who's, I mean, of course, we want to bring all these struggles together, and because they're all struggling against imperialism, but also I think that the Kurdish struggle particularly has got so much to teach us about how to do it. And I mean, it's very interesting to me, I think, as well, as someone who's Jewish, and I think that a lot of Jews actually will find a personal empathy with the Kurdish struggle, with the idea of a people that have been just persecuted for being Kurdish. But what the Kurds have done, the Kurds who follow Öcalan have done, is show us how to resolve that situation without sort of going into that ethnic national trap that created Zionism. So in the Kurdish struggle, they've actually made it an essence of the Kurdish struggle to be multicultural, to support different minorities. And that almost become a central thing of Kurdish culture to them, that different minority cultures should have room and survive. And there's a very deliberate, we don't want to be a nation that persecutes other nations. So perhaps, just thinking it from the Jewish perspective, I think what they're doing will perhaps resonate with the Jewish Bund, the traditional Jewish socialist movement, that obviously not with Zionism. So, yeah.
But Sarah, the Bund is a horribly kept secret from most people, even people who'll be listening and viewing now. The mass socialist anti-Zionist movement among Jews of Eastern Europe that ended up being exterminated, but held out against Zionism to the very end. You just alluded to them, but you would, I think, like to recover that tradition, yeah? Absolutely,
yes. I mean, it's a tradition of saying, you fight for fairness wherever you are, and not that separatism. And I think, so I do, and obviously I've talked about a Jewish example and I've talked about a Kurdish example, but I think every movement has those examples. And it's those that can come together and boost each other.
So the Middle East, the whole of the Middle East and North Africa is mainly Arab, but there's huge national minorities. And some are Arab. I mean, the Egyptian dictatorship in the past has whipped up hostility towards Christians in Egypt, the better to control the masses. Berber people, non-Arabic speaking people along North Africa are fighting for their national rights. We have Druze and Alawites and so on, all sorts of national minorities, Armenians and so on, and Kurds, of course. And the Palestinians are groaning under Zionism, which wishes to dispossess them virtually entirely. I just can't see any solution to the crisis of democracy, the absence of democracy from tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people across the Middle East, unless at the heart of it is the idea that these national minorities can have a renaissance, can have a safe place inside an Arab polity. Does the Kurdish experience fit into that? Does that make sense? Applied more widely.
You've just said an Arab polity, which is just one ethnic group. So I think,
No, the dominant one. I don't mean it to be Arab, but, in a dominant Arab demography, let's say, there needs to be a renaissance and a flourishing of minorities, yeah?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the most inspiring things I saw when I was over there, we actually went to Man Beach, which is really, really multi-ethnic. So that's not a Kurdish majority area. It was one of the areas that they liberated from ISIS. I think it's probably now got Syrian and Russian troops in it. I'm not quite sure who's in control there just at the moment. But they'd been under ISIS for a long time, and they, of course, absolutely welcomed the YPG and YPJ coming to liberate them. That's the Kurdish. It's that the YPG is the male the forces, and the YPJ is the female ones. But what the Kurds were then doing was trying to work with people there and really bring the different ethnicities together. So we were welcomed at a meeting that had Caucasians, Turkmen, Arabs, and the Kurds. Everything had to be translated into about 3 different languages, and it was amazing. Then they were talking about how they were, getting people to remember how communities had lived together in the past before people were definitely trying to divide and rule them. And also the other thing they were very, very much doing was trying to get the women involved and get the women out of their homes, because these are people who'd lived under ISIS. And it was so exciting to see that. And God knows what's happening to all these places.
So these Kurdish women's militias, these military formations went up against ISIS, the bloody rats who organised the sexual enslavement of women across their domain. And these women fought them and often defeated them, yeah? That story needs to be told.
I think that story is told because the photographers just love women with guns. But yes, I mean, and I think what struck me as well as actually the YPJ, the Women's Defence Forces, but also just the women doing things in the villages, and the elder women as well. We visited what they call a commune, which is basically the sort of organising group for just a small area. It was just about a few streets in Rojava, and these women were just sort of meeting and taking control and running things and going to education classes about how to do things better and thinking of the ideas. And it was just, it's just how things ought to be. It's a funny thing because I think here in this country, we've actually got a huge number of local community groups that sort of run things and do things, and without whom actually a lot of things just wouldn't work and would fall apart. But all those groups make a sort of pride of not being political and not working together to make a bigger political change. And that's just so wrong that they've abstained from making that bigger change. Because there are people who do things, it's not a particularly Kurdish thing. And so I just feel we can learn so much, and all movements that are trying to make a better society can learn so much from what's being done there.
Mm. Finally, Sarah, I want to thank you for being here. But listen, you're Jewish, you're Scottish. Why don't you go to Israel and live among Jews? Why do you want to stay here?
Why should I go to Israel? I mean, I think we should all of us live, trying to make a better place at the place where we are. And that's what I hope I'm trying to do, and, going, learning from ideas, the best ideas from everywhere, showing solidarity everywhere. But I think we need to act where we are. And
in that spirit, you're a co-founder of Scottish Jews Against Zionism. Could you say a few words about what you mean by Jews Against Zionism?
Well, there's been a long history of Jews arguing that Zionism is not the right answer. And I mean, I can't support any form of ethnic nationalism from any group. So why should I support it from the Jewish community? And I think it's really, but we just feel that it's important to make it clear that there's a Jewish voice against that, and that you can be Jewish without being Zionist, you can be a Zionist without being Jews. It's a political position, and it's a position that no one who wants a progressive, better future in which people can live together can support.
God forbid you should leave Scotland and go and live in an ethnic state. Sarah Glynn, thank you very much for coming on the programme today and telling us your experiences there and your thoughts and analysis about what's going on there. Sarah Glynn, founder member of Scottish Jews Against Zionism, co-convener of Scottish Solidarity with Palestine. Thank you very much for coming on. I've got a few announcements, guys. In if you've got any, Sarah, I've got a question here that popped up, but you answered it in the course of what you were saying.
Can I say one more thing? Are we still on?
Can I stop you? On you go.
Yeah, because I mean, people might be saying, but what can we do? And I haven't answered the what can we do question. So, you know, we had a lot of fine words from all the politicians, but they're not going to do anything unless they're really, really pushed from below. So what we're calling for is a no-fly zone over northern Syria. We're calling for really serious sanctions on Turkey. And we're calling on people themselves to boycott Turkey, and especially boycott Turkish holidays and Turkish airlines, so that your holiday isn't paying for the genocidal Turkish army.
Yeah, I believe a couple of European states have even temporarily but banned arms sales to Turkey, but the Brits continue to...
No, they have put a...
Have I got that wrong?
They put a hold on further. I'm not quite sure quite how much they've done. They've done a certain amount, but yeah.
Okay, but the Brits have done absolutely nothing, of course, but make the situation worse. Sarah, thanks very much for that. Guys, just a couple of announcements. Something that's actually quite shocking before I talk about this book and the author speaking in Scotland. The Israelis a few years ago had a cyber security conference, they call it, at which somebody from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said they were going to start a program. This was 2016. They would start a program to impede and harass the communications of supporters of boycott, divestment and sanctions, the Palestinian-led solidarity strategy. And what they would do, they said, is they would prevent or impede or greatly attrit, is the military term, I think, our email communications, but we would think that they were getting through, but they wouldn't be getting through in bulk, maybe allow a trickle to get through. So it's a very high-tech facility they have in Israel. Maybe they're the best in the world, maybe second only to the Pentagon, but they are able to intervene and damage communications by those who are in support of the Palestinians. Let me give you one shocking example. And it was told to me, well, it was told to me by somebody who's not a hothead. He's actually an emeritus professor. But in the list last week, they shared an email with an attachment. He looked at his email before he disappeared into the metro, the subway in London. Looked at the attachment, and then he didn't have time to read it. When he got home, the attachment had disappeared. And all the people on the list, the attachment had been removed from their emails after it had been delivered. Now, we don't have that degree of intervention, of intrusion, but what we do have is a real impeding of our email and emailing facility. So I'm asking for your help. We have this meeting coming up. Thursday, Glasgow, Friday, Dundee, Sarah's hometown, and Sunday in Edinburgh. He's also speaking at the Unite Conference, Construction Workers in Ayr on the Saturday, but that's not a public meeting. It's the publicity for this meeting that has been greatly hampered and impeded. Andrew used to work on building sites and oil rigs in Scotland. He now is a professor of social and cultural analysis at New York University. He's written extensively about working classes in Shanghai, 0 hours contracts, and so on and so on. 20 published books. He's quite a significant academic figure, and he's turned his attention to Palestinian workers, stone men, he calls the book, the Palestinians who built Israel. Now, it's an axiom for socialists and others who look at the subject that in South Africa, the labour force was made servile, was made inferior, was controlled, but was integrated into the process of exploitation. Whereas in Palestine, it's different. The Zionist plan is to disappear all the Palestinians. And there's a lot of truth in that, but it's not the whole truth. And Andrew writes about the Palestinian stonemasons, the building workers, and through that experience, he tells the story of Zionism in Palestine. And some of the detail is just wonderful. Many of you will know that the Zionist project wanted to uproot olive trees and replace them with alpine species, often with disastrous consequences. Zionism also, to Europeanize Palestine, had a real antipathy towards Palestinian stone workers and stone. The people have been building the buildings there for a very long time, and they prioritized concrete as European and national against these beautiful stone buildings of old Palestine that some of us have been in. And that's just one, but it changed. So what Andrew Ross tells the story of the settler-colonial project in Palestine, but very much through the experience of these workers. They've been proletarianized, their land has been confiscated, they have to work to feed their families, and how they resist as a working class or as a section of a working class under Zionist occupation or Zionist apartheid if they're citizens. It's a fascinating story. I think there's two reasons for turning up. One, you'll benefit, but two, the main Scottish cities now have adopted the IHRA definition, which is going to be used to shut down much discussion on Israel-Palestine. The Zionists are making some progress in their lobbying of the SNP and the Labour Party, and the Lib Dems, of course. So things are moving in a way that is not altogether healthy. And we ask you, and some of us have been in court for many years over the last decade, facing charges of racism for BDS activity, and more and more and more. So please support these meetings, Thursday, Friday and Sunday. Spread the word on your social media to build the meetings, to show that we are not at all defeated, that we will fight back. When we fight back, Sarah Glynn and Jews Against Zionism will be a key part of that struggle. But Sarah, thanks again for coming to help us to discuss the need for better links, but the strategic relationship between Israel and Turkey, and therefore the need to build links between different struggles for freedom across the Middle East. But the last time, thanks very much, Sarah Glynn. Goodbye from me. This recording will be available in a very few minutes on this Facebook page. It'll be polished and tidied up and made available on the SPSC website in a relatively few days. Again, thank you very much. Take care and goodbye.